Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It looks like I was muted, not saying anything, so let me repeat what I said, which is this is JB Fowler. We're here to go over a couple of the basics of Domotz for you. In this webinar, we go over a lot of the essentials of how to get started with Domotz. We also follow this up with a 201 training, so I encourage you guys to watch both of these. When you are ready or when you have time. Before we get into the meat of the discussion, let's go over a few just general housekeeping items. First of all, this is live. We've got a team of people standing by here to answer questions. If there are any questions that are pertinent, I'll try to check the chat or the questions panel and answer those live. Otherwise, we'll get to them at the end. If you do have questions that are more technical in nature or that you think maybe can't be answered easily over this webinar, by all means, reach out to support@domotz.com. Other than that, you guys know the fundamentals of webinars and how they work, so we will continue on with the agenda. Today, we're going to talk about what is Domotz, how it works. We'll get into the meat of the account management side of it, as well as licensing and how that works. Talk a little bit about agent activation. I have to say, for those first three fundamental items, you're probably aware of some of this because of the fact that you're here and that you've probably created a trial account, but we'll go over it again just to touch on some key points. We'll get into some of the fundamental features as well of Domotz, such as the network topology, making connections, setting up basic alerts in this. We'll also talk about some of the infrastructure management, maybe things like monitoring servers. And then at the very end, we'll get a little bit of an overview of what's going to come up in the 201 webinar as well. So with all that being said here, let's go ahead and move into it. So what is Domotz? How do we see Domotz getting used? Domotz is used by thousands of service providers and integrators. The fundamental ways in which we see Domotz getting utilized is for network-based asset management and documentation, right? Giving you a really good understanding of what's on the network. In fact, many of you should be aware that this is a fundamental premise of some of the CIS controls that are out there. Knowing what's on your network is one of the first steps in ensuring that your network is secure. Of course, Domotz is also a network monitoring and management tool. We help you better understand the network infrastructure. We will help you with backup and restore of the configuration management side of the network. We will help you diagnose problems that are on the network. We ultimately will help give you visibility into all the different systems that are on the network, and we'll talk more about that in this demo and in this webinar. And then the third way in which service providers use us is really for security and awareness. As I mentioned, right, control number one of the CIS controls is about awareness of what devices are on the network. But then when you look at things like control number 12, it's really about network infrastructure management and ensuring that all of the systems on the network are backed up, they're secured, they're managed in the right way, which Domotz helps you with. But another way in which Domotz is such a powerful tool, aside from knowing exactly what's on the network, it's also looking at which ports are open on these devices or these systems that are on the network. Again, giving you awareness to potential vulnerabilities or threat surfaces or attack surfaces. So in that sense, Domotz is extremely helpful for you as a service provider when it comes to these three components. Let's talk a little bit about how Domotz itself works. Domotz is a cloud-based system. We're hosted in Amazon Web Services. We get asked that question quite a bit. Within AWS, we have different data centers depending on where you are in the world, whether you're in North America, whether you're in Europe or the rest of the world. We have data centers that are associated with the different regulations and privacy laws that are attributed to those different regions. The cloud is where a lot of the intelligence within Domotz sits. It is the cloud and that infrastructure that is giving commands to the agent, right? That agent fundamentally is a collector or a probe That agent can be hosted on a variety of different operating systems, whether it's Windows, Linux, it can be hosted on embedded systems like Raspberry Pis, it can even be hosted on NAS drives, as you can see. I'm sure some of you are aware, but if not, you will be now. There is a little black box that acts as a server, which is running Ubuntu Core as its operating system that you can find on Amazon. It's roughly $130 US, depending on where you are, where you can also have a dedicated box that's associated to the Domotz platform. That agent, right, that software, that collector is always communicating to the cloud in a very secure, encrypted way. And it is that that agent that is receiving commands to and from, or giving commands to and from the cloud, that allows it to monitor the network, look for changes on that network, scan the network as appropriate, and aggregate information about the different devices that are on that network. The Domotz front end, also known as the application, is what allows you to visualize the data that is being collected and aggregated in that cloud. The cool thing about Domotz is that this front end can be associated in a couple different ways. One is there's a web app. You can view the Domotz data through your favorite browser, your browser of choice, whether that's Chrome or Safari or Edge, whatever it may be. You also have a dedicated desktop application that can run on Windows and Mac, which gives you a little bit more capabilities as well, especially when it comes to taking data from that cloud and putting it into things like Excel files or importing and exporting of data. And then another way in which you can visualize data is through a mobile app. So we have on both iOS and Android a mobile app that you can take your devices or your agents with you anywhere in the world. Before we get into the details of the demos, another thing that I want to point out is this collector, right? Deployment of this collector is really fast and easy. When you associate the agent with the cloud, you fundamentally are putting in your username and your password into that, and then that will automatically associate the Domotz agent to your account that's in the cloud, right, over that secure network that we talked about. That is when the agent, after you've done that activation, that is when the agent will start to collect as much information as it can about the networks that it is exposed to. We'll talk in some details about how we do the scannings, but fundamentally, any MAC address that is associated with the network that we are scanning, we're going to provide as much data about it as possible. We're going to look at each system when it comes to managed switches or other network infrastructure devices. We're going to try to interrogate them further through things like SNMP or through RESTful APIs that may be provided by a manufacturer to bring as much information about those devices as possible to the Domotz cloud. The beauty of all this is that it's extremely fast, it's extremely easy, and we simplify that for you. So how does the scanning work? A couple things to note, right? ARP scanning, right? Layer 2 type scans are what we use to discover all of the MAC addresses that are out there. Once we receive the MAC addresses at that layer 2 level, we then associate those MAC addresses to our database to do our best to classify these devices by make, model, and type. And you'll see that in some of the demos. I will say that at the basic level, the agents are set up to monitor up to a /22 network, meaning that you can have 1,024 devices or a range of 1,024 IP addresses associated with a single agent. I will tell you that because we do get this question a lot, we do have enterprise plans available, which is a little bit different structure than what we have, where we can monitor up to a /16 CIDR. So Domotz itself can monitor extremely large networks and enterprise-based networks as necessary. If you're interested in that, I highly recommend you reach out to support@domotz.com or our sales team, and we will talk to you about that. A couple of definitions that I want to get out there. First of all, when we talk about attached networks, we're talking about VLANs. These are systems where the agent itself and the network interface card associated with that agent, or the host that the agent is running on can see the VLAN tags associated to the different VLANs. That is what we consider to be an attached network. In the case of routed or private subnets, these are what we would consider to be layer 3 scans. We're looking at IP addresses. This fundamentally is what layer 3 is about, which is IP addresses when you look at the OSI networking model. Domotz can scan private subnets, and we can provide information about devices that are on those private subnets. But there's a third type of network that we look at as well, which is external facing networks or public host names. So we have the ability, and we'll show this in some of the examples, where you can put in something like bluejeans.com or zoom.com or any other external IP address or host name, and we can monitor that service or that system as well. One of the things you'll note when it comes to looking at protocols, right? We will scan a layer 2 level, we'll scan layer 3, looking at those IP addresses, but we also extract information from devices that are at the application layer of the OSI model. So we are looking for things like ZeroConf, NetBIOS, Bonjour, UPnP, right? Other application protocols that are on the network. All that being said, one of the core things that I think you should take away from Domotz here is that we are fundamentally meant to be a tool for you as a service provider, you as an integrator, even you as an IT professional, to help improve your operational efficiency and to help provide you with proactive monitoring. Fundamentally, what this means is that we want to lower your operational costs, right? We want to improve your revenue streams if that's something that you need to do within your business. But we also want to give you a reason to look like a hero to your customers. And I think that is what Domotz is about. The beauty of it all is that we tie these two things together in an easy to use, simple to deploy interface. So with that, before we get into the details of Domotz, let's take a look at some of the capabilities of Domotz. So let me bring this up on our screen. Let me increase the size a little bit so you can see exactly what's going on here. First thing I want to mention about Domotz. When you first install a Domotz agent, the thing you're going to run into likely, or the very first screen that you're going to really see, has to do with our dashboard, right? The very first agent that you install, you're going to get to this screen. Couple things that you'll notice on this screen is the devices list. Okay, when you dive into that, this is where the Domotz collector has aggregated all of the different information about the devices. We'll talk in more detail about how we will interrogate different systems, but a couple things I will point out is that from this screen, if we have access to a lot of the network infrastructure, right? If you have used either default SNMP credentials or community strings, we're going to discover those and start to interrogate the network and start to look at or build a topology around these. For instance, if we go and look at a particular managed switch, again, under the Access Manager tab, if we've used the default or if you've provided us with the authentication credentials into those systems, we're going to start interrogating that system. We're going to show you details about all the interfaces, which devices or which systems within the network are connected to these interfaces. In fact, we're going to go as far as starting to back up the configuration files of this network infrastructure, whether it's through a firewall or a managed switch. We're doing that so you have the ability to understand when configuration files change and get alerts on those things. Right? We want you to know what's going on in this network infrastructure so that you can better serve your customers as needed. So this is just some of the capabilities when we start to interrogate this system. Okay, when it comes to wireless access points, right? These in particular, I believe, are ruckus-based wireless access points. We start to look at information around this wireless access point, such as the CPU utilization, the memory consumption that's on these. We'll look at which clients are connected to these SSIDs of these systems, what radio frequencies these devices are on. We'll get as much information about these systems as the access points will provide us. We'll look at each individual device when it's wirelessly connected and look at things like its RSSI values, right? Looking at things like signal strength, determining is this a weak signal or not. We help you get visibility there. So there's a ton of information that you can find just from this dashboard alone on these particular devices. Now, as we get into some of the more advanced features, and I'm just going to dive right in before we get into some of the basics, and this is really just to give you an overview of some of the capabilities. When we go into the manage interface of Domotz, we can look across all the devices, across all the sites, and across the networks that we're viewing. This is a really good time to point out that Domotz really is a multi-tenant environment. So we're set up so you as a service provider, when you're dealing with multiple customers or multiple systems, you can aggregate all of that information across those customers in one user interface. If I want to look for very specific things, like in this case, well, let's look at an ESXi server that is in my particular system. Let's go to devices. Let's look at a particular site here. So this is looking at anything that has ESXi, and I have to remember which one it is on right now. I want to say it's on this one, actually. Let's see here. Well, I may have to discover this. There it is. Oh, it was on the Draper office. Excuse me, I was on the wrong system. But when we discover the devices across our networks, what you're going to see is that we have the ability to quickly find those devices, of course, if you know the right name and the site that it's on. And then we can interrogate these systems. In this case, this is a server that's hosting several different virtual machines. We can aggregate information from that system, such as the builds that it's on, the versions, the vendor that it's coming from. We can even look at a lot of the physical device information, such as the memory, how much memory is being consumed. We can look at the physical and logical disks, right, the hard disks, and see how they're configured. We can even go as far as looking on these systems at the different servers, or excuse me, the virtual machines that are set up as servers on this host. And we can provide lots of different information about that. So this is just another way in which Domotz becomes a really powerful tool for endpoint management and understanding what hosts look like. Even when it comes to looking at different types of systems that are not standard, what I would consider to be standard service provider devices, but let's say we want to look at embedded systems or IoT devices that are on the network. We can do that. Here's an example where we're looking at security cameras. We can discover that the security camera is online, but we also can see that it's functioning properly. So we can grab a snapshot. We can see what that camera is actively seeing at this point in time. Okay, so this is a view of a driveway here. We can see what's going on. So not only are we determining that the camera's online from a network point of view, but now you as a service provider can have confidence when it comes to talking to your customer about how this system that is on that network that you're monitoring or managing is actually working properly as well. So just another example there. Let's do one more thing, right? Let's look at, I think if we look at a Synology NAS drive, so I think we have one in this lab as well. So I must have typed it wrong, Synol. There we go. So when we look at things like NAS drives, same things go with printers and servers. We have the ability through things like SNMP to have what we call pre-configured sensors, where we can look at exactly how these systems are configured. We can bring in a lot of the basic information about these devices, such as, you know, what's its temperature, what's the headroom available on the different disks that are out there. With respect to Synology in this particular system, we can see what firmware versions that are on there. And in fact, we can even see that there's an upgrade available for this system. A very powerful tool to allow you to better understand what's going on in the network, and per things like CIS controls, where you need to make sure the network infrastructure and devices connected to the network are updated as as readily as possible, you can see that you have that here. So this is just yet another example. The one last thing that I want to mention before we get into the meat of the discussion, let's take a look at things like power distribution units. We talk about helping you be more operational efficiency. Sometimes, well, not sometimes, problems will occur on a network, and sometimes a power cycle is all you need to fix it. Okay, when we look at things like power distribution units or PDUs, we give you the ability to associate the outlets on those PDUs with different devices within that network, but then being able to power cycle those systems as well. In fact, you'll notice, let's just take this Epic 5 here, a router that I probably should not power cycle, but if I do a search for that particular system, even if I go look at the details of this, you'll see that we have associated that device with a particular outlet, and I can power cycle it directly from that device. I also can go in and look at things like the switch it's connected to and the bandwidth it's consuming of that device on average. So these are just a lot of the capabilities. This is an example of some of the things that Domotz can do for you as a service provider. With that being said, let's talk a little bit more about account management and how we handle that. As most of you guys have recognized when you started in or when you created the account, right, you had to provide yourself with a username and password. At the point that you did that, when you created that account, you automatically got associated as a team master in that account. That team master allows you to manage the team. It allows you to add agents, view all the agents within your environment, okay, within your account. You also have added details like billing information, which we'll talk about here in the next few minutes as well. The team master is the end-all be-all, call it super user of your account. The team master can add team members. They also can add field operators. They also can remove team members and field operators. Team members are essential to your account in that they allow you to add and view all of the different agents within your account. So team members are going to essentially be like administrators. The only difference is that they cannot add team members, and nor can they take them away, but they also cannot see the billing information associated with your account. And we just do that for simplicity. The difference between a team member and a field operator is that field operators can add agents to the environment. When they add an agent, they can have access to that agent, but agents can also be removed from the field operator's purview, okay? So this gives a little bit more capabilities when it comes to securing your agents. If you have large organizations or large teams where you want to ensure that certain users or certain people within your environment only have access to specific networks or agents, then the use of a field operator is very helpful there. Okay, so just keep that in mind. There's one other capability here that we don't talk about on this this slide, but Domotz does have the ability to do what's called collaboration, where you can bring visibility into the different sites through Domotz and through our user interface. But a collaborator does not have access into screenshots of the system. Collaborators are also thought of as third-party users. They're not necessarily a part of your team. They can be an outsider that has a Domotz account that you then share your system to. I would also point out that you have the ability to provide Domotz with access to your system, which is really helpful when it comes to support, and it can be revoked very easily, or that access can be revoked in the same way that collaboration can be revoked. Okay, let us move on to how you activate an agent, and in some sense we can talk about licensing at this time as well. First of all, when it comes to licensing, right, a Domotz agent and activating an agent, you pay on a per agent basis. Essentially, when you have a Domotz agent activated, you pay that $21 per month for the full standard license. It has basically an unlimited number of devices that it can look at within reason, of course, right? You're limited by a lot of the network and some of the capabilities there. You can have one agent in your account. There's no minimums to purchase other than that one agent to keep you going. You can stop the service at any point in time as well. You'll notice that within your Domotz account, okay, under the billing section, in fact, let me go to that now just so you can see that here. Bring it up on screen. So if you go into account and go to your billing info here, I went there, by the way, from the left side of my menu. You'll see here that any upcoming invoices or historical invoices show up under your account, and you can get details about that there. Okay, so one thing I want to point out when it comes to agent activations and the licensing, because we do get this question a lot and people maybe get confused, Domotz bills you in advance based on your billing cycle. A couple things to point out, right? When you first created an account, you had a 14-day trial on that account. Your billing cycle, assuming that you inserted a credit card, starts on the 15th day, right? The day after your trial would end. So you can put your credit card in as early as you want. We're not going to bill you until that 15th day, okay? At that point, that is when your billing cycle does begin, and we will charge you for the number of agents that you have active at that time. Here's what I want to point out. Domotz bills in advance. So when we bill you on that first day, you're billed for the next 31 days, 30 to 31 days, depending on the month. If you add an agent during your billing cycle, you will see what looks to be a double charge for that agent. But in reality, what we are doing is billing you for the agent when you activate it during the billing cycle. And then on that next month cycle, we're billing you for the agent going forward. So just keep that in mind. You're not actually being double charged. You're actually being charged for the month you used it in, as well as the month that you're going to use it in. So we always like to point that out because our team does get questions on that fairly often. With that being said, let's go back into Domotz and let's talk about some capabilities and things that you see going on. So we've talked about activating an agent. By the way, I should mention, I said this before, but you activate an agent simply by inserting your username and password. The ways in which you can gain access to an agent or deal with an agent like we talked about. You can get it through Windows, you can get it through various Linux packages, you can install it on a NAS drive, depending on the NAS drive app store that's there. Under portal.domotz.com, or in my case, I'm looking at it on the desktop app. When you go into your account, you'll see the Add an Agent page where you can then easily download these agents and then install them as appropriate. I'm not going to go into the details of the actual install, but I will tell you that if you go to help.domotz.com under the agent activation section, or if you type activating an agent, there's a lot of information and details for each platform and how those systems can be installed. Once you've installed that agent and you've inserted your username and password, again, that's where the magic takes over and Domotz starts to scan that network as appropriate. Let's talk a little bit about a few things on your account before we get into some of the details of the system. When you are at portal.domotz.com, or when you have gone into these sections within your desktop application, you'll notice on the right there is the account section, okay? Within the account section, you can add all your details about billing information. You can add company logo or company title information in your website. You also can go to the branding page. The importance of this branding page is this is what allows you to put your information into your reports that get generated for your customers if you do that. Or you may have also noticed that on the Knox screen itself, okay, here, you will see under, whether it's under this page or not, you'll see your logo up here. Under the manage page where you have this map, you can also see your logo. In the 201, we're going to talk about your ability to generate reports within each environment. You'll notice under the dashboard of these systems, you can do reports and logging. This is also where many of the details of your account get populated. And this is so that if you send that report directly to your customer, they have your information and they're not getting a report from, say, Domotz. So that's important when it comes to branding. One of the things that we think is really, really important, of course, is security of your environment. We always recommend you utilize something like two-factor authentication or a service like SAML or single sign-on for identity management. It's very important that you ensure that your account is secure by using one of these services. I will also point out that when it comes to team management, right, adding those team members, adding those field operators, as we've talked about, you can also ensure that they are utilizing 2FA or single sign-on as appropriate for your environment. So please, please, please take advantage of that. Last thing I want to say when it comes to managing your account, right, within this account page, of course, you can get in there and change your passwords as appropriate. The settings section, this is where we start talking about a lot more details, and I just want you to know we're going to dive into this in the 201 section, so we won't go over that now. Let's talk a little bit about how Domotz itself works, right? We talked, I showed the overall structure and how the cloud associates to the agent, and how then the applications associate to the cloud, right, for visibility of what's going on. Let's talk a little bit about how you can start to set things up. As I mentioned, the very first thing that happens when you activate a Domotz agent is that we start to scan the network. We talked about it scanning at a layer 2 level and associating MAC addresses with layer 3. We try to enrich this data with as much as possible by make, model, and type. In fact, if I go into this camera here, you'll see at the bottom of this info screen or info tab where we start to aggregate all of this data. We'll look at the name. We try to classify it by type. If there's a model that we can associate to it, we do that automatically for you. We also provide all of the different application layer information as appropriate or as we can see from these systems. So this for us is a core part of what Domotz does for you automatically. I already showed you, but I'll speak to this again. When it comes to the network topology, what we are doing is we're looking at the network infrastructure, and then based on how those systems are set up, we will essentially try to create a map for you. We'll look at the different RFC protocols. We'll use some proprietary information within Domotz or some proprietary algorithms within Domotz to help build these parent-child relationships. Of course, we'll also utilize things like LLDP, Link Layer Discovery Protocol, or Cisco's Discovery Protocol, right, CDP, to try to aggregate this map. We think we do a pretty good job of building out this map. Of course, you can get as detailed as you want within this structure and start to zoom in on each one of these systems that are on here. If you want to click on a particular site and go into its interfaces to see which interfaces are tied to exactly which ports, you can do that as well. Some more details that we aggregate about the network, you'll notice things like power consumption when we're dealing with PoE devices. And in fact, I'll just mention this now, as we start to interrogate the systems more, we can start to see information from the network infrastructure, like how much bandwidth is being consumed by particular devices on that network. Are there any errors or packets being discarded by these systems as well? And all of that is information that we're aggregating from the network itself. Let's talk a little bit. In fact, I don't know if you noticed, but under this devices tab, you'll notice that we have things where we can start to configure the VLANs, what you can start to configure subnets, okay? Essentially, when it comes to a VLAN or an attached network, as we called it, right, you can set up your host, or you have to set up your host such that the network interface card can interrogate those systems. Lots of information about this on help.domotz.com, and you can get kind of an overview of this from this page as well. Essentially, though, you have to configure the network interface card to be attached to a VLAN if you want to do true layer 2 discovery through Domotz. If you are dealing with a routed network, or you're doing a detached network, or you're looking across sites through a VPN, you're really looking at layer 3 or through subnet monitoring. You can come into this system. You can add a modem is a great example of a device that sits on the other side of a router. So it really is looked at as an attached network or a subnet. You can add that here, and you can start to look for that device and interrogate it there. Lots of details about how to set up a proper subnet, but it is possible through Domotz here. And then the last thing that I wanted to say is when you go to configure an external host, here's an example where we just put in bluejeans.com in our external host name, and then we can start interrogating that service from the point of view of the agent on the network. Okay, so it's not coming from the cloud, it's actually coming from the agent, where it's routing out through the modem and the router out to that service to ensure that it is seen as online. In fact, you'll notice that we even ping this thing with a frequency of every 30 seconds, and we aggregate that data and put it in here. So you can start to look for performance issues or changes in the network. In fact, here's an example where we did see an increase in average latency from this system. So just another way in which you can interrogate systems overall. Let's talk about the device properties and what you can do within each device. So if we scroll down here to some random device, let's look at this Ratio device. I don't know if it's a wireless device, it's on the network. You can come in and edit any of these properties that are here. You can change the device type. So if we tried to discover this as a particular device type, but you want to change that, you can do that here. If I had a particular model that I wanted to insert here, I could do that. The beauty of this is as you start to add these details to Domotz, we add this information to our database until we get to a critical mass where we can then start automated awareness of what either these models or makes or types of devices are. So keep that in mind. You can do things like add information, location information or zone information. The one thing I want to say to you about the naming conventions of the devices themselves or the location and zones, you should name these in a way that makes sense to you as part of a process for you as a service provider, as you as an integrator. When it comes to managing all of the devices that are out in your networks, it will make it easier for you to search and find devices if you use a common nomenclature. For instance, if I want to look at all of the SG350 systems that are out there, ensuring that I have a common way of discovering or finding these devices is important. So just keep that in mind as part of your process that you implement. Something I want to show you on Domotz. I mentioned that it's an excellent asset management tool. So when we go into a particular site, okay, and we look at all of the devices that are associated to a site, you do have the ability through the desktop application to export this device list to an Excel file. When we do this, we will just save it to the desktop here. And then what I will do, which I have not opened up Excel, let's go ahead and I'm going to do this on this other page here. I'll go to the desktop and open up this file. I want to point out that this Excel file that we give you provides you with a plethora of information about the devices that are associated with this network. So you can see all the devices. You can see, of course, all of the network-based information that's associated with these devices. But more importantly, what you can start to do with this system is you can come in here and filter by particular device type. You can come in and change information as appropriate. There's some information you can change, some you cannot. For instance, you cannot change the IP address, you cannot change the MAC address, but you can change the names, you can change the locations, you can change whether this is an important device or not. You can save all these details. And by the way, this is where you can also make notes about these devices and then save these details back into the Excel file. But then what you have the ability to do, I won't save it here because I don't need to change anything, but then what you have the ability to do is actually import that Excel file with the changes back in there. A great way to make mass edits to systems. It's also a great way to document at a point in time what is on the network. So just keep that in mind when it comes to how you utilized Domotz from a documentation perspective. We're going to talk about it in the 201, but I'll also mention it here just so you guys are prepared for this. On the left-hand tab or left-hand side, you'll see the integrations tab. Under the integrations tab, you'll notice that we also integrate into many different types of documentation tools. Service providers will often use tools like IT Glue, IT Portal, Hoodoo to document all of the information that they have as they're using it with a traditional RMM. Domotz can feed all of the non-RMM, right, or a lot of the IoT assets and the network-based assets into those documentation tools as well. Okay, so I think you have a good understanding of how we handle kind of the assets, how you can go in and set some of the properties. If there are more questions, I invite you to reach out to our support team or look at help.domotz.com if you want to do more of a self-help. Let's talk about proactive monitoring and how you can set up Domotz to actively monitor and manage systems that are on your network. When it comes to devices that are on the network, okay, you can come in and set up many different types of setups. Let's just look at this Apple Watch. Not that you would put an alert on an Apple Watch, but we'll talk about how you can do that if you wanted to. Under each device, you'll see there is an alerts section. I want to take time now to talk a little bit about the difference between a shared alert as well as a personal alert. A shared alert is one where you are utilizing a PSA tool or a ticketing system. You may be using a messaging system across teams, or you're sharing it with multiple users, right? Or you're sharing it with another system. That is why we call it a shared alert. A personal alert, on the other hand, is one in which you can generate an alert to either your email that you are logged in as, okay, in your account, or a personal alert can also be seen as a push notification to a mobile device, all right, your mobile device, where again, you are logged in as that user on that mobile device. The different types of events that can trigger alerts include either device type alerts or what we call network alerts. Since we're on this device, let's talk about device alerts first. You can set up a trigger to be associated with a device going up or falling offline, right? You can look at a device having an IP address change. You can look at a device even when a heartbeat for us is when we issue an ICMP request, or really 3 ICMP requests in a row that fail. ICMP requests are commonly known as ping, okay? We do a heartbeat once every 30 seconds, and if you lose that heartbeat, we can generate an alert. This is a point where I want to tell you, for most devices that are out there, I highly recommend you just utilize the device goes up or device goes down to generate alerts. One thing I'll mention here too, you may have noticed under the info tab, there is this status section. This Apple Watch would be considered a wireless device, so they put a 10-minute window on it, but you can come in here and adjust the windows to use a default time. So if you are dealing with a wireless device or a device that maybe it's a sleepy device, maybe it goes offline regularly, you can increase the status check time on that. If you receive a set of heartbeats that are associated to this, in this case, 10-minute window, right, with this device, or 2-minute windows are standard for wired devices or infrastructure devices. If you receive that many heartbeats lost during that time, then we would generate the device going offline, right, or going down. So that's how that gets utilized. You also, on an individual basis, can attribute alerts within a device to things like SNMP sensors. Okay, we'll talk more about these in another, or in the 201, but you can go in and trigger based off of SNMP values, whether it's temperatures getting too high, ink levels getting too low in a printer, CPU performance going out of bounds, right? There's lots of different sensors that you can trigger. TCP happens to be when something like a service running through, like for a web page, right, on port 80, if that goes down, you can also trigger alerts on that. And then lastly, I'll mention this, which is if the latency of a particular device starts to go beyond a certain threshold, or if you're seeing packet loss increase beyond a particular threshold, you can generate alerts for that as well. You can imagine that on a system like an Apple Watch, right, or a wireless device, you may get quite a bit of packet drops because that device may not be online all the time. Let's talk a little bit about network-based alerts. Okay, so when I come into a site, when I'm looking at agents in particular, I can look at how the alerts get set up on these systems, okay? So when I go into the device itself and I go into the alert settings page, here's where I can start to, again, set up shared and personal alerts as appropriate. But I can set it up so that if the network itself is lost from the cloud, right, if that agent is no longer communicating with the Domotz cloud, I can set an alert on that. If new devices are being discovered on that agent or within that network, I can set alerts on that. Very important when it comes to understanding security issues or possible vulnerabilities on a particular network or a VLAN that's out there. Domotz can also generate alerts when we see ports being opened at the firewall, okay, or the modem router level of a network. So if there are TCP ports that are open to the cloud, we can alert you on that. And likewise, when devices are trying to open up UPnP ports, right, so universal plug and play ports out to the network, we can alert you on that. Again, both of these are or can be seen as security vulnerabilities, and bringing awareness to you about that is something that we think is important from a Domotz perspective. Of course, if your network itself just changes, right, if you have a public IP address change, or if something on your LAN changes, we can alert you to that too. One of the things that people utilize within Domotz happens to be ISP speed testing, and we can also alert you there as well. So once every 6 hours, we'll do an ISP speed test where we try to maximize the bandwidth, both on the upload and the download, and then report on that data. I always call this out, and there's notes associated with this. As you guys fully understand, depending on the host that the agent is running on, depending on the different configurations within your network, these speed tests can vary. But as long as you understand that and you understand how speed tests work, then this becomes a very useful tool for you for understanding bandwidth out of the network that you're monitoring, as well as just understanding performance in general or when you have bottlenecks there. Okay, so we've talked about alerting, we've talked about essentially device alerts versus network alerts. In a simple use case, let's say a particular device gets into a troubled state or there's an alert issue associated with it, the very next thing you want to be able to do is remotely connect into that device. One thing I'll point out, right, as we look at particular devices here, you may have noticed this, but when we discover these devices, we also look for which ports are available on these devices. We do this for two purposes. One, and the fundamental purpose is for managing of these devices. If you need to be able to remotely connect into a particular device because it needs to be reconfigured or it needs to be managed, you can do that. If I can remember my password into this, it would be helpful. What we did here is after we discovered the device and discovered the port, you may have noticed that I clicked on the connect to port 80 button, and then we brought up this browser. You saw that I added my credentials for that particular device. In essence, we created a reverse tunnel into that device through the cloud. So I created a secure connection from my laptop here in the office into the Domotz cloud, which then created another secure connection back into the agent, which is then looking at the page of this particular network switch. You'll notice that this URL up at the top here is unique. It is something that is only associated with my laptop. And if I tried to pass that off to even another user under the same IP address or within the same local area network as my laptop, it would not work for them. But at this point now, I can get in here and reconfigure the system, go in and adjust whatever I needed to do to make this system work for me, okay? Another way in which we can connect to systems, actually if I go back to this page, is we can do what we call a VPN on demand. So I showed you how we can make a direct connection to a device. Another thing that we can do is turn the Domotz agent, right, that collector or probe that's on the network, into a VPN host, at which point we can then open a tunnel. I won't do it since we're on a live webinar here, but I can, if I were to create or open this tunnel, we would get a configuration file that's associated to that agent, which then I can load into a VPN client, and we can create a secure tunnel over the Domotz cloud into that network. This would allow me to look at all of the devices that are associated with that network, which is really useful if I'm trying to debug systems, trying to do firmware updates on systems, or trying to just in general access multiple systems on that network for whatever purpose is needed. So you see that I can now easily access not only a device directly to get in and manage it, do firmware upgrades, change configurations, manage that system however I can do that. I also can create access through VPNs, right, or through a VPN into that system. One of the things that I showed briefly before, but I want to show it again because I think this is an important or useful tool for you guys as well. We see service providers utilizing this more and more, but we see this heavily used in the integration world, where users are installing, AV equipment or unified communications equipment into systems. The ability to access a PDU, associate a network-based device or a non-network-based device, what we would call a dummy device, to a particular outlet, so that you can then power cycle that remotely. That's another way in which we can help you remotely manage and connect to these systems. So I just wanted to briefly mention that here. Out of all of this, okay, I've shown you how we discover devices on the network. Of course, we've also talked about how you can configure your account. I want to, let me bring up this page. I want to reference here as well, help.domotz.com. If you go to onboarding, or if you type the word onboarding, there's a great guide here about walking you through all of this information that I just talked about, which is how do you set up the account, how do you create it, how do you start to configure alerts. They even go a little bit further to talk about what we're going to do in the 201, which is setting up SNMP, right, and creating remote connections. We've really gone over all of those details for you right here. So with that being said, let me give you a little bit of an overview as to what we're going to be talking about in the 201 session, so that way you're prepared for that. And then we'll look at any questions that we may have received over our Q&A panel. First of all, in the 201 session, we're going to talk about reporting and logging. We're going to talk about some network diagnostics and performance capabilities within Domotz. You probably noticed on the dashboard as well, this network security tab. We're going to give an overview of what that tab does, how it works, and what it means to really utilize that for you as a service provider. And then when it comes to more details, right, I really just showed you kind of the basic dashboard of each agent. We're going to go into a lot more details about the Manage tab here. We're going to go over the monitoring dashboards where you can create custom dashboards within Domotz. And then we're also going to go into how to set up things like device sensors, both from an SNMP perspective as well as TCP. So that way you can start to aggregate a lot more data and get visibility into sensor history and triggering alerts off that. We mentioned shared alerts, and we talked about how they can get incorporated into a ticketing system or into a messaging platform. We'll go over more details about that and configuring that, but we'll also talk about how you can create an alert digest to aggregate data into a simple report so that you can check the status of all of your networks or all the alerted systems that happen over a period of time. And then we were also going to talk about some of the more advanced integrations that Domotz has, such as looking at other cloud-based systems. When you think of Meraki or you think of Ubiquiti's Unify, how we can associate Domotz into that to get more data about those network-based systems as well. And then lastly, we'll touch on some documentation systems too. So that being said, let me take a quick look at some of the questions that I received or that we received in this. Looks like we got a lot of information on here. And let me look at a lot of good questions. I totally appreciate these. We got a great comment about some competitive stuff, how they love the Domotz UI and how it gets utilized. So that's a great thing. It looks like we have an AV integrator on here that says, what's the lowest cost option for adding a Domotz box? I think that's a really good question. I'll tell you the lowest cost option is using a system that's already on a network and putting the free Windows agent or putting the Linux agent hosted in like a virtual machine out there. That's the cheapest way to do it. A lot of times you'll have a NAS drive, like a Synology or a QNAP NAS drive that's out there. And again, you can host an agent there. So that's capable. I will say the Domotz box, if you go through a Domotz box, we have a couple different partners that are out there that sell that box. The easiest and fastest way to get a box though is through Amazon. You know, it's $130 US on Amazon. If you buy in bulk, you can get a discount through business.amazon.com. Just keep that in mind. We have a question here regarding what looks to be like a little bit larger network. So if they have a client that's using a /19 network, right? So if you have a CIDR that's something a little bit larger than the 1024, but only has a couple hundred devices, will the agent work with that? The answer is yes, right? Any of the Domotz agents, right, whether it's through Linux, through Windows, or the Amazon box, okay, can be associated with up to a /16 network. But what we do have to do is you do have to contact support, and our support team has to reconfigure that agent for you. There's some backend stuff that we have to do on that agent to enable that. Of course, you need to make sure that the network interface card and the router or whatever's handling those addresses, right, have the appropriate subnet mask as well. But our support team can work with you there. Definitely reach out to support@domotz.com, and our team, our customer success team, can help you with that. So we have a couple, I'm seeing a couple technical questions on here that are probably better to have our support team work on. So somebody's using the trial here, and they've identified 2 open ports. So by all means, Our support team can help you look at this exactly to see what issues may be associated with that particular system. So reach out to support@domotz.com and they can help log into that system. In fact, under the device management section, I'll just show this to you here. So when you look at a particular agent, you'll notice that under the access management tab, you can provide Domotz with access to this. This is going to be one of the very first things that our team asks for. But once you do that, they can help log in and look at the exact issue that you're seeing there. We got a question. This is a great question. Where do I download the desktop app? Let me show you. So let's go to Safari here. If you go to portal.domotz.com, I likely will have to log in with my account. Hopefully my address was saved there. You will notice under apps on the left-hand side of your portal here, you will see where you can download the Mac or Windows-based application, right? The desktop application here. I'm on a Mac, that's why I see it downloaded for the Mac OS, but if you're on the Windows machine, you'll see that. I will point out that the web app, right, if you open that up from here, you really have a lot of the same capabilities as the desktop application, with one exception, which is I previously showed you under the agent itself how you could go to the devices tab and you can import or export to an Excel file. That is not available yet on the web app, but it will be available in the coming future. And that's the one difference between these two. So, okay, let me look at one last question here and then we will end this. How would I have to? So let's see here. Always a good question. Can you get a copy of this webinar? So we're in the process of updating this webinar because of the fact that we changed our user interface fairly significantly with the manage and the monitor interfaces. I will tell you that we do have previously recorded webinars available on domotz.com under our resources tab, but our team is updating these webinars to have a lot of the newer UI. In fact, you saw a glance of, or a glimpse of that when it came to some of the slides I was showing today, but we're improving those, and probably within the next 2 or 3 weeks, you'll have this full recording that's there. So all that being said, I appreciate your time. Thank you for joining us. Hopefully, and I see that our team did answer a lot of the questions that were available or that came up, so that's great. If there's anything that we'll miss, we'll try to reach out to you. Also, if you have any other more in-depth questions or you want to know more, or you want to have a personalized demo, by all means, reach out to our support team, so support@domotz.com, and we can get one of our onboard specialists or customer success team members on the phone with you and do a Zoom call. Thank you so much, and I appreciate everything that you guys are doing and appreciate all the questions. Have a most wonderful day. Thank you.
Knocked it out of the park, JB.
Hold on. Hold on. Hold on. Where is...